There was one night when the United States almost disappeared before it was even born. By Christmas of 1776, the revolution was collapsing. New York had fallen, thousands of soldiers had deserted. Others would leave in just a few days when their enlistments expired. The British didn't think they were fighting a war anymore. They thought they were simply waiting for the rebellion to die. Then, on the coldest night of the campaign, one exhausted general looked across a river filled with ice and decided to bet the future of an entire nation on a plan that should never have worked. If the crossing failed, the Continental Army would almost certainly be destroyed. The revolution would be over, and the United States would become nothing more than a failed experiment remembered only in history books. But that isn't the most incredible part of the story, because Washington's greatest enemy that night wasn't the British Army. It wasn't the Hessians waiting in Trenton. It wasn't even the frozen Delaware River. It was time. Go back a few months and understand exactly how bad things had gotten. In March of 1776, Washington had 16,000 men under his command. He had just pushed the British out of Boston. The revolution felt unstoppable. But then the British came back with everything they had. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers. They crushed Washington at the Battle of Long Island. They pushed him out of Manhattan. They chased him across New Jersey through the cold and the mud for weeks. By the time Washington reached the Delaware River in December, his army of 16,000 had shrunk to barely 3,000 men fit to fight. Some of them had no shoes. Their feet were wrapped in rags, leaving bloody footprints in the snow behind them. And here's the part that should terrify any command. Most of these men hadn't signed up for years of service. Their enlistments ended on December 31st. In less than a week, Washington's already broken army was simply going to walk away. Not because they were cowards, because their time was legally, officially up. So picture the position Washington was in. He didn't have an army that could fight a long war. He had an army that was about to stop existing entirely on a calendar he couldn't control, no matter what the British did. And the British knew it. General William Howe had pulled most of his forces back to comfortable winter quarters in New York. He left a string of outposts across New Jersey, including roughly 1,500 Hessian soldiers, hired German mercenaries, stationed in a small town called Trenton. Howe wasn't worried. Why would he be? He thought the war was basically finished. He thought the rebellion would simply dissolve over the winter, the same way Washington's army was about to. And then, a pamphlet started circulating through the freezing camps along the Delaware, and Thomas Paine, who had already lit a fire under the colonies with common sense, wrote something new. He talked about the difference between the soldier who only shows up when the sun is shining and the one who stays when everything is falling apart. Washington had it read aloud to his men. Whether it actually changed anyone's mind, nobody really knows, but it tells you something important. Washington understood that this wasn't just a military problem anymore, it was a psychological one. He needed a win, not eventually, now. So he came up with a plan that on paper looked almost reckless. Cross the Delaware River at night in winter with an exhausted and freezing army and hit the Hessian garrison at Trenton before dawn. He divided his forces into 3 separate crossing points. General James Ewing would cross just south of Trenton and block the enemy's escape route. Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south near Bordentown and create a diversion. And Washington himself, with roughly 2,400 men, would cross 8 miles north of Trenton at a place called McConkey's Ferry, then march south through the dark to hit the town at dawn. It was an ambitious plan. Maybe too ambitious. And here's something most people don't know. Washington couldn't have pulled any of it off without a regiment of fishermen. Colonel John Glover commanded the 14th Continental Regiment, a unit made up almost entirely of sailors and fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Black sailors, Native American sailors, white sailors, all serving side by side in one of the only integrated units in the entire Continental Army. These were men who had spent their lives reading water, not battlefields. And on the night of December 25th, Washington needed every bit of that experience. The boats waiting for them weren't small rowboats. They were Durham boats, 60 feet long, built to haul iron ore down the river, and now packed instead with soldiers, horses, and 18 pieces of artillery, each cannon weighing close to a ton. General Henry Knox took one look at the operation and thought it was impossible. The river was choked with broken ice, sharp enough to tear through a hull if a boat drifted the wrong way. And it wasn't just the ice. The temperature was dropping fast, somewhere between 29 and 33 degrees, and a storm was building over the river that nobody had fully accounted for. Glover looked at Washington and told him not to worry. His boys could handle it. They had to, because there was no version of this plan that worked if the boats didn't make it across. Think about what Washington was actually asking these men to do. Not march into a battle, not charge a position, just survive a river crossing in the dark, in a storm, with nothing more than wooden poles and oars against moving sheets of ice. And if even one of those boats capsized in the middle of the channel, there would be no rescue, no second attempt, just men disappearing under black water while the rest of the army watched watched from the shore, unable to do anything but keep loading the next boat. At around 6 in the evening, the crossing began, and almost immediately everything started going wrong. The weather that had been merely brutal turned vicious. Rain turned to sleet. Sleet turned to snow. The wind came in off the northeast and cut straight through every layer of wool the soldiers had. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Men loaded 40 at a time into the Durham boats, gripping the rails with hands that had gone numb an hour earlier. Glover's sailors worked the long oars and iron-tipped poles, fighting the current and the ice flows that kept slamming into the sides of the boats. Every trip across took longer than the last. What was supposed to take a few hours stretched into the entire night. And somewhere in the dark, on the Pennsylvania side of the river, the other two crossings were already falling apart. Ewing's men never made it across. The ice near Trenton was too thick, the current too violent. Cadwallader's men managed to get some troops onto the New Jersey shore, but couldn't get the artillery across and pulled back. Two-thirds of Washington's plan had just collapsed before midnight. 2 of his 3 columns simply weren't coming. And here's the part that should stop you for a second. Washington didn't know that yet. He was still on the river, watching his own men struggle across in the storm, with no idea that the army he was counting on to support him from the south had already failed to show up. By the time the last boats reached the Jersey shore, it was nearly 4 in the morning. Washington's plan had called for the crossing to be finished and the army marching toward Trenton hours earlier. He was already badly behind schedule, and now he had a choice to make. Turn back with the storm worsening and his support columns gone, or push forward alone with 2,400 frozen and exhausted men toward a garrison of professional soldiers who outnumbered nothing about this in their favor. He chose to go forward. Stand in his boots for a second. He has no idea yet whether Ewing or Cadwallader are even alive, let alone whether they're waiting for him somewhere south of Trenton. He has a soaked, freezing army that hasn't slept, hours behind schedule, with daylight now working against him instead of for him. Every reasonable instinct in an 18th century general's training says retreat, regroup, try again when conditions improve. But Washington had already run the other version of that decision in his head. Turn back and the army melts away on December 31st anyway. Turn back and there is no later attempt, because there is no army left to attempt anything with. The storm that was supposed to be his enemy had, without anyone planning it, also hidden his approach from anyone who might have warned Trenton he was coming. And before they marched, Washington gave his men a single phrase to use that night if anyone needed to identify a friend in the dark and the chaos. 2 words: victory or death. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't something written for a painting or a speech. It was a password scrawled out in Washington's own hand, meant to be whispered between exhausted men trying not to lose each other in a blizzard. But it also happened to be almost exactly the truth of where they stood. The march to Trenton was 9 miles through snow that hadn't stopped falling since the crossing began. Some of the men had no shoes, only rags tied around their feet, and you could trace parts of that route afterward by the blood in the snow. Muskets got soaked, and soaked muskets in 1776 were close to useless. Washington gave a quiet order that the attack would happen with bayonets if the gunpowder failed. There would be no retreat planned into that order, only forward. At around 8 in the morning on December 26th, the Continental Army reached the outskirts of Trenton, split into 2 columns, and came down on the town from 2 directions at once. Inside Trenton, the Hessian garrison had no idea what was coming for weeks. American raiding parties had harassed their outposts just enough that the soldiers had grown numb to small skirmishes. And in the brutal cold of a snowstorm, almost nobody believed an army would attempt a full river crossing and a 9-mile march to attack at dawn. Colonel Johann Rall, who commanded the garrison, hadn't posted the kind of long-range patrols that might have given his men any real warning. And then, through the snow, the Americans were simply there. What followed was fast, brutally, almost unbelievably fast. American artillery, the same cannons Glover's men had fought all night to drag across the river, opened fire down the main streets of the town before the Hessians could properly form their lines. Soldiers who only minutes earlier had been asleep or just waking up were suddenly fighting in the open, in the snow, against an enemy that wasn't supposed to be there. Doors kicked open, men running into the streets half-dressed, reaching for muskets they hadn't had time to load. For weeks, they had treated this army across the river as a problem that was slowly solving itself. Now it was standing in their town. Rall tried to rally his men and was shot from his horse, mortally wounded. Within roughly an hour and a half, it was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. A few hundred escaped across a creek to the south, and on the American side, not a single soldier was killed in the fighting. 2 had frozen to death on the march. That was the cost. Now here's the detail that makes this whole night even more remarkable, and it's the kind of thing that gets lost in the textbook version of the story. The fighting was over by mid-morning, but Washington's men men still had to get back across the Delaware, this time hauling nearly 1,000 prisoners, captured weapons, and supplies in boats through a river that hadn't gotten any less dangerous since the night before. Glover's men, who hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, climbed back into those same Durham boats and did it all over again. So what did one freezing night on a river actually change? Everything. Trenton wasn't a massive strategic victory in terms of land or territory. It was a small town, a few hundred prisoners, one morning of fighting, but news of it spread through the colonies in days, and it landed like a thunderclap. For months, all anyone had heard out of Washington's army was retreat, defeat, retreat, and suddenly this. Soldiers whose enlistments were set to expire on December 31st chose to stay, some convinced by the victory itself, others persuaded by Washington personally offering $10 in hard coin to remain just 6 more weeks. Just enough time for Washington to strike again at Princeton days later and turn one desperate gamble into a real campaign. The revolution that had been quietly dying in the snow along the Delaware was somehow still breathing, and maybe that's the part of this story worth sitting with. Washington didn't win that night because he had a better army than the British. He didn't win because the weather cooperated or the plan went smoothly or the odds were ever really in his favor. 2/3 of his own plan fell apart before midnight, and he crossed anyway. Glover's men climbed back into freezing boats for a second night with no sleep, no real reward waiting for them, nothing but the next crossing in front of them. None of it should have worked, and for one morning in one small town, none of it needed to. He won because he understood something that no general can teach you in a textbook. Sometimes the only way to outlast an enemy who thinks you're already finished is to refuse to be finished, even when the river is full of ice, even when the clock is the only thing you can't fight back against. Somewhere on the Pennsylvania side of that river, in the freezing dark, an entire country's future came down to whether a few hundred fishermen could keep their footing on a wooden deck. They did. And that's the whole story, really. Not generals, not strategy, just ordinary, exhausted people deciding one more time not to stop. If a story like this is the kind of thing you want more of, the rest of the channel is exactly that. Real history told the way it actually felt to live through it. Stick around for the next one.